And welcome back to Capital Tonight once again. So Governor Cuomo ran on a very clear platform that he has stuck by ever since taking office. He says he will not raise taxes or borrow money, so the state's nearly $11 billion budget gap will have to be closed through significant cuts in the budget. And that, of course, means that the sacred cows of the past, healthcare and education, will likely lose billions of dollars worth of funding. Well, today, one group on education advocates made a clear statement that they are not going to stand by quietly and let this just sort of happen. The Alliance for Quality Education pledges to fight against those cuts while also releasing a new study that suggests that low-income communities are the ones that will be most impacted by further reductions in education aid. Bill Easton is the executive director for AQE. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Liz.
This isn't rocket science. I mean, I read this report and thought, okay.
Well, you're right. I think that New Yorkers get this. New Yorkers across the state get that if we cut funding for our schools, all students will suffer, but the neediest students will suffer the most.
Right. Well, basically, the title of the report is I'm going to just demonstrate it, unequal opportunity equals unequal results. The basic premise is that when there are lower income schools, you have lower performing kids. I thought that the CFE case that you guys were involved in, it's sort of in depth, was supposed to be addressing this, and did to a certain degree. Did it not?
Well, the CFE case exactly was about this issue, and the Campaign for Fiscal Equity was finally, there was a statewide resolution reached by the legislature and the governor in 2007. They made a commitment. 4 years, $7 billion increase in school funding,
right.
Most of that for classroom operating aid, most of that for the high needs districts. The state met its obligation for 2 years, and then it stopped.
Well, because they couldn't afford it.
Because of the fiscal crisis, right. In all fairness. But last year, this past year, they made $1.4 billion in cuts. So what did we see as a consequence of that? We saw more teachers leaving the classroom, kids in more overcrowded classrooms, after-school programs, sports, arts, tutoring, all important things for kids' education being cut, eliminated in schools. And, kids in the neediest schools are the furthest behind.
Okay, well, here's the problem. I mean, you and I feel like we've had this conversation before. The money has to come out of somewhere. There's a $10 to $11 billion budget deficit, depending on who you believe.
Sure.
And the bulk of the spending in New York is from Medicaid and education. We also have some bond payments that we have to make. Those some of these are required. You can't get out of what you pay. Okay, so where is the money going to come from if it doesn't come from education?
So our position is this. Number one, I think everybody knows that there's going to be cuts in all areas of the budget. But before we cut a single dollar from our children's education, it seems wrong to say, oh, we're going to eliminate the tax on the wealthiest 3% of New Yorkers. There was a big public debate about that a few years ago. We got a higher rate on the wealthiest New Yorkers. This year alone, that's $1 billion. Next year, it's $4 to $5 billion. How can we possibly say that before that giving a lower tax rate to the wealthiest New Yorkers is more important than our school children? It just doesn't make sense.
But Billy, New York perennially ranks high up there in the amount that it spends per pupil, and yet we still have deficits, and yet we still have low-performing schools, and yet we have all of these problems that you so eloquently delineate in this particular report. So doesn't that undercut your argument when we're spending so much per pupil in New York on average?
No, it doesn't, and I'll explain why. Number one, we have gotten a lot of progress out of the increased investment that we made in our neediest schools in those 2 years, 2007, 2008. We saw improvement. We saw closing of the achievement gap. We saw real improvement. Number two, we also have some of the best schools in the country. Okay? We have more Intel scholars than any other state in this country. Do we want to say, oh, let's have less Intel scholars? Oh, let's have less kids graduating and going to college?
I don't think anybody would say that. I don't think anybody would actively say, let's have less anything. Let's have less health care. Let's have less road improvements. Let's have less innovative tax credits for business growth. Nobody wants to say any of that. The governor says, I want all of these things, and the spending is fantastic. We just can't afford it. We can't afford it.
Well, again, I would go back to that we've said that we recognize there's going to be cuts in all areas of the state budget. We're not saying zero cuts in education. We understand the state is in a very difficult position. However, it's a question about what are our priorities. Are we going to say, okay, I already gave the example of the millionaire's tax. In addition, the wealthiest New Yorkers just got an $8 billion tax cut from the federal government.
Right.
So there's dollars there which maybe wouldn't entirely solve the state budget problem, but we could think more creatively. We could try a little harder. And the other part is this. When it comes to education itself, we really need to have an open, honest, and transparent conversation about education. It doesn't help the conversation to project out there that, oh, we spend too much and not getting enough back in return. Yes, we need to spend dollars well. In fact, there are times we should be spending it better than we are. We've been an advocate of that. But we also need to recognize that that money has been paying off, has been increasing educational opportunity.
And similarly, you argue that some of this competitive funding structure that the governor alluded to, we haven't seen the details yet, in his State of the State address, could actually put low-income school districts at a disadvantage because they're not as high-performing and perhaps don't have the resources to compete the way higher-income schools do. Then the problem, however, is that a lot of these higher-income schools are in high-impact Senate districts in particular, obviously also assembly districts, but the Senate is where the battle is going to be for control. You are involved in this relationship with NYSIT, the teachers union. They're giving you $425,000 to run a field campaign, basically, to pressure lawmakers to vote against the budget cuts. Is that what it is?
Well, what it is to organize communities, parents, teachers, students, clergy, community members, to get engaged around the budget process. And yes, to raise the pressure for protecting our schools. In many cases, we'll hope that work on those districts involves lobbying and rallying around senators and assembly members of both parties in support of if they're standing up against cuts. If they are going along with cuts, then it'll be pressure on them.
Okay, you were joined by about a dozen lawmakers today at a press conference at the Capitol.
Yeah, like 16 or 17, yeah.
Okay, and who were they? They were all Assembly Democrats, were they not?
And there were some Senate Democrats as well.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, we had the education chair in the Assembly, Kathy Nolan, who was there.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously, this is a continuation of a theme that we've already seen. The Republicans lining up with the governor and his fiscally conservative message, the Assembly Democrats being boxed out. They're in the majority. The Senate Democrats not going to be able to provide the votes, but really probably doesn't matter because if the Senate votes in a block in the majority, there's nothing you can do. Unless you do pressure so hard on some of these key districts, so where would they be specifically?
Well, you have the new senators who usually we find are more responsive to bottom-up pressure within their districts. The incumbents tend to be
terrified.
The incumbents tend to be pretty entrenched, where the leadership in the Senate has said, oh, well, we're against the millionaire's tax too. So we don't think that necessarily represents what people in, say, Niagara Falls would believe or what people in Watertown would believe. We think, or even people in a place like Yonkers would believe, because those schools in those communities will suffer if we give a tax break to the wealthiest 3% of New Yorkers.
Right. I mean, certainly polls have shown that people are not amenable to big cuts in health care, but they're not amenable to tax increases, and they don't want their services cut. It's just not realistic. Obviously, in a perfect world, no one's amenable to that sort of thing. This is like, your approach is sort of like culling the weakest from the herd, because you're talking about freshman senators who haven't had a chance to establish themselves, maybe in some marginal districts, and the threat is, we're going to work against you and you're going to lose your seat. I mean,
I don't know that the threat is an electoral threat. I think it is, I don't know if I'd call it a threat, but what it is we are saying we're going to make people in districts around the state aware and engage people in the democratic process. This is democracy in the real sense. Instead of just TV ads and, all of the, you have the Committee to Save New York that the governor's helped organize. It's raised $10 million to run TV ads to advertise in favor of cuts to education, in favor of whatever else they're going to be for, and, for cuts in taxes for the wealthiest New Yorkers. We believe that a bottom-up effort from people in the community will be more effective, and will get the response of legislators when they hear from people in their own districts.
Okay, let me just ask you this in parting. If $1.4 billion last year was the education cut that was historic and you thought too significant, and that we're saying that there is going to be some degree of cut, what percentage of cut is something that you think is something you could live with?
You know, I'm not prepared to say, here's the cut we're prepared to live with. I am prepared to say that $1.4 billion, the largest cut in history, is a good measure to look against. If it's more than that, then it becomes, you know, if Andrew Cuomo, for instance, were to propose a cut that's larger than $1.4 billion, his first step in education as governor would be to propose the largest cut that was ever contemplated in the history of the state. Okay? If he proposes something smaller than that, well, then, you know, he would avoid that bad distinction.
Okay. Billy Easton of AQE, I want to thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be talking to you again soon.
Thank you very much, Liz.